Hey guys, another mode here. This is our last mode of writing for these 3 weeks that we've kind of been working on these 6 modes. So far we've covered narration, description, process analysis, cause and effect, and definition, and here we are looking at compare and contrast. The majority of this kind of slide here in this video is going to really kind of try to highlight the organization of a compare and contrast essay, but it's also going to cover some other stuff. So the purpose of writing a compare and contrast is obviously to talk about similarities and differences. For the purposes of our class, I will use the word contrast to only talk about the differences of something. Comparison, I'll try to keep that limited to the similarities, although you should know that the word comparison, if you are making a comparison and talking about the similarities of something, by default you have to talk about the differences, or maybe you don't have to, but you probably will. So if you are, this really matters for later on, because academic writing is often filled with comparisons and contrasts, and so if your instructor says compare two things, this could be in a history class, this could be in science or business or literature or whatever, just by your instructor using the word compare, they are telling you to analyze similarities and differences because the word can encompass both. If they only use the word contrast, then you should be just looking for differences. If you're not sure, of course, I would just ask your instructor at that point, but comparisons and contrasts are found throughout writing prompts in your academic career, so I'm sure that you're going to run into doing this later. There are a couple of things that you can do with a compare and contrast essay. You can either use the compare and contrast in order to explain why something is better than another thing. If we're thinking about comparing two stores, for example, maybe you are comparing them to say that, well, here's why Target is better than Walmart, for example. The other thing that you can do in writing a comparison essay is one of two things. You can take two or more subjects and compare them side by side and sort of like burst your reader's understanding of something. Maybe they think two things are very similar, but they're really not. They're really very different. Or maybe your reader thinks that two things are very different and can't be compared, and that you can write an essay on how those two things could be more similar and surprisingly so. For example, I once read an essay on how death is like going on a cruise ship, something like that. So you'd think, how is that even possible? But then the author wrote kind of an interesting exploration of the similarities, and so there's sort of a surprise factor in that concept. And then also, you don't have to write a comparison and a contrast in order to surprise your reader or try to convince them of something. Maybe they just want information. You guys will probably have encountered an informational comparison at some point already. If you've had to purchase a car, if you've done any kind of like research on different products on a website, say you're looking at Amazon and Amazon compares for you the specs of something. Even if you've just, like, maybe you've had $20 and you wanted to buy a shirt, you had 3 shirts, and so you try them all on and you compare which one, like the way the shirts make you look, the colors, and how it blends with like your complexion, or the sizing, the price, whatever. So you've probably done this yourself or looked at a comparison that's purely informational, although I guess if you're shopping, it's ultimately to pick a superior product, but you might not always be looking for superior in the moment. Alright, so preparing to write a compare and contrast really is, I think, best done using a synthesis matrix. And first you come up with all your ideas, figure out what you want to say about two subjects, or more. You don't have to just compare two things. But you come up with a bunch of ideas and then you start to kind of categorize those ideas. So if you think about maybe buying a car, that's one of the examples that we're going to look at here. Well, what are all of the different things that you could consider when buying a car? You could consider price, gas mileage, horsepower, what the interior looks like, how many seats the car has, how many doors the car has, the type of engine that the car has, how much maintenance is usually, the main problems of the car that you'll run into over the next 5 years or whatever. I said gas mileage, maybe like how big the tank is, I don't know. So all of these things are relevant, and then you want to kind of narrow down your focus. What is your goal of your essay? And what focal points would be best to look at in your paper? Now, depending on how much information you have and how much research you're doing, you might find that you have at least one, but probably two body paragraphs for every focal point that you're going to pick on your compare and contrast essay, because you should address both of, if you're looking at two cars, for example, you should address the price of both cars. And you can either do that in one paragraph, or you can do it in two. And again, it really just depends on how much research you're doing for the content. Now, there are good thesis statements and there are bad thesis statements for a compare and contrast essay. A good thesis statement is going to identify the focal points like we've talked about all semester long. It's going to identify the focal points that you're going to address, because if you think back, the reason we even write thesis statements, it's like a free sample. We are giving a little bit of a glimpse of our paper for a reader. So a bad thesis statement is just going to say, here's the compare and contrast. If we look at some examples, these three, they're both somewhat alike and somewhat different. Well, that's really not helpful. That's probably just true no matter what. And you could say that about a whole lot of things we could compare, but your reader isn't getting a sneak peek into your essay by saying that some of these have similarities and some of them have differences. Also, if we say both of them involve a single similarity or both of them involve no differences, whatever, not identifying what those specific points of comparison will be is a detriment to writing a thesis statement for this essay. So when you guys are doing your brainstorm, I want you to have some better thesis statements. The first one, Ralph and Jack have very different leadership styles, that's one, and motivations, that's another, which leads to the eventual chaos and anarchy on the island. So we're making some kind of judgment here within this thesis statement. Looking at the second one, this looks to be more informative. In order to make a decision between the Honda Civic and the BMW, consider the following criteria, and here the author lists three: price of the vehicle, average mileage, and price of insurance. So they're saying out of all the things we could look at, think of everything I listed before, making a decision probably is going to come down to these three things. And you could think about like an essay, the comparing and contrasting an Android versus an iPhone or something like that. All right, here's really what I want to focus on in this video, which is block or alternating arrangement for your body paragraphs. Block arrangement, think of it this way. If we think about the Honda Civic and the car example, block arrangement means you talk all about the Honda Civic for the first half of your essay, and in the second half of your essay, you talk all about the BMW. That's also called subject by subject. So the Honda Civic is a subject and the BMW is a subject. You might see that. Alternating arrangement would be, first you talk about the focal points, focal point one, and you talk about it with the Honda Civic and BMW. So what I mean by that is the price of the Honda Civic and the price of the BMW. Then you switch to a new focal point where you might analyze gas mileage of the Honda Civic and gas mileage of the BMW. And then you go down and you look at your final focal point, which would be price of insurance for the Honda Civic versus price of insurance for the BMW. I think for the most part that alternating, this is also called focus, I think focus by focus, something like that. Alternating arrangement, going back and forth between each one of your focal points with your subject matter, is the better selection most of the time for organizing your essay. The reason I say that is that the block arrangement can sound, and here it is in sort of this last point here, the block arrangement can sound almost like you just smashed two essays together without actually comparing and contrasting them. If you just talk about all the specifics and you don't have nice transitions kind of reminding your reader of what you addressed before, then that block arrangement where you talk about everything about the Honda Civic and then everything about the BMW really doesn't flow very well. Also, if you have a lot of similarities, I mean, imagine if you were comparing two things that were mostly similar and you used a block arrangement. What you say in the first half of your essay and what you say in the second half of your essay are going to sound really, really similar, and it might almost sound repetitive and in like an ineffective piece of writing. So be really, really careful in what type of organization you select. Here is a visual, but I think that this makes more sense. I'm skipping that visual. So here's kind of an example of what I talked about before. It's like you would address everything with, I don't know where this cursor is, you would address everything with BMW, and then you would address everything with Honda Civic. Again, imagine subject matter where A, B, and C were mostly similar to your second A, B, and C. That would get really, really, really repetitive, so I would say that's something to kind of be careful of. Then another, skipping this visual because it's confusing to me. Another outline for alternating. This I think looks better, kind of what I addressed before. But instead of talking all about the Honda and then all about the BMW, you first just address the focal point of price for both cars, then mileage for both cars, then insurance for both cars. And this is going to have a smoother flow to it, and it's going to kind of allow you to, I think, get in way more detail for each one of the subjects that, or each one of the focal points that you're addressing for your subject matter. Really, there are just a couple of things to kind of keep in mind as you write your compare contrast essay. You want to make sure that you equally or almost equally address both subjects. So think about BMW versus Honda Civic. If you're going to have 3 points to talk about for the BMW, you should probably also have 3 points for the Honda Civic. It's easy to do that if you're thinking of such similar items such as cars, but if you have an essay where maybe you don't have 3 specific points for each one, it'd be okay to maybe address 3 points for one subject and 2 points for the other. What you don't want to do is talk about 6 points for one subject and only 2 points for another. You want to try to have as much of a balance as possible. Also, as you see here kind of in the second sentence, whatever you address with one subject, if you are able to, you must address that with the other. So you can't look at the price, insurance, and mileage of a BMW and then look at the number of seats, horsepower, and color options of the Honda Civic, because you are not comparing apples to apples at that point. You are comparing apples to grass or something like that. You also want to make sure that you pick the right sort of essay organization. This slide says do not mix. There might be times where a mixture is effective. You get to decide that, but I would say if you're new to compare and contrast, not mixing is the best bet here. And then of course, make sure you understand your goal of writing your compare contrast essay. Are you going to explain which one is better? Are you making a judgment? Are you just informing? What is your purpose there? All right, well, that is our compare and contrast. If you guys have any questions in addition to reading the chapter content for the week, please send me an email and let me know.